It's difficult to say when you're in the very middle of the desert, but it certainly feels as if it's the hottest day of the year, as you are riding in the back seat of a big, boxy car that is bouncing down a dirt track that seems as if it has been etched into the face of the desert like a long scar that stretches all the way towards either the horizon or infinity, whichever you might come to first. Outside, the landscape is flat and barren and so intensely beige as to be almost no color at all. But if you arch your head back, you can see through the rear window blue sky and three birds circling there, vultures, who must know that when a car is this far from civilization, it won't be long before one or all of its occupants will be dead. I'm offering up the usual protestations that have been offered up to me countless times, always to no avail. I am not the man you think I am, but I'm not being very convincing, and frankly, I don't believe I'm trying to be. The car is driven by a man who appears to have no nose. There's a divot where a protrusion should be. Beside him is a woman who is not ugly, but she is neither attractive by any standard measure, nor by any measure for which there is no standard. I've never known my mother. There is no image of her in my mind. I was pulled from her womb and pulled from her grasp before my eyes had had a chance to focus. And so I ask you, what chance does a boy have who's never known even one moment of love from his mother? And so I hope you can appreciate how strange it is that this woman should somehow appear to me maternal. So much so that if I could, I would lean forward and beg for her embrace. But as it is, behind my back, my hands are bound so tightly that I can no longer feel them, and it's now as if I now have no hands at all. As I say into the stale air of the car, I am just a butcher. And I laugh then, the only human sound in this vehicle. The faces of the others averted, proof that even now they fear me, even as we drive deeper into the desert, deeper into the almost unknown, where all that is known is that a freshly dug grave must surely await me. And yet still, I am made to laugh. The final human sound heard by so many souls who've perished before my eyes, whose lives were ended by these hands, whose cries for mercy were met with this terrible laugh. A laugh so awful that to hear it as you lay dying is to believe that all of creation has been for this one moment of terror. And yet still, I am made to laugh. Though I hope you understand that when I say it is me who is laughing, it is not. For me, I am just the body. And it is my role to move when my mind makes me do so. To fill these lungs when I am made to breathe, to beat this heart faster when my mind grows excited and craves more blood. My mind, from which I've grown so estranged that it's safe to say I no longer know it whatsoever. I do not know why it makes me do the things it does, but do them I must. I am just a puppet to its master. And it is my role to bear witness and act out a series of scenes, each more violent, each more terrible than the last. We all have a voice deep within our bodies, yearning to be heard. But I dare say that none so loathe their mind as do I. And yet still, I am laughing. For the others do not know, you can't kill me. I have been alive for centuries. And they don't seem to know that even now I am readying myself to act. And then, of a sudden, I do launch myself like a javelin from the back seat to the front. I spear the crown of my head into the column of the steering wheel. The driver, startled, he swerves left, swerves back again right, overcompensates, his hand slipping from the wheel, finding purchase in my mouth where I am commanded to bite down more forcibly than I have ever bit upon anything in my life. He yells out in pain, loses control as he swerves again left, down an embankment, up the other side, where we are launched into the air, a moment suspended in time as we twist end over end. A moment of almost grace, like a ballerina suspended in air, before we crash back down into the earth, into the sand, rolling across it as all goes black, but the sound remains of the car's bones crushing into rock. We stop moving. It is just now the moans of the others as death slowly wraps them in its embrace. And me, my body is broken, my legs twisted into an impossible shape. Maybe I will never walk again. But my mind, my head smashed against the windshield, dashed against the dashboard with such force that my mind is gone. So that when I move, this is the first time I have ever commanded myself to do so. So that when I speak, these are the first words I will ever have uttered. I have landed in the lap of the woman. We look at each other, her upside down to me, her eyes trembling with the fear of the end. A bubble, red and glistening, inflating out of one nostril. It is sucked back in and blown back out with each rattling breath as I look up at her and say, "Love me. Please, love me. Before it's too late. I beg of you. Please." We are looking at each other, and then she is looking at nothing at all. And that bubble deflates and slides down across her upper lip, disappearing into the blackness of her slack jaw. As me, I recoil. As I pull myself away, drop out the blown open door of the automobile onto the desert sand. And on my elbows, I slide across the desert floor. Slide away from that car, away from anything and everything as the birds, the vultures, descend upon it and begin to eagerly pick their way through it before they see me, and stop and begin to waddle in my direction. As I think finally now it comes, because these creatures, above all others on earth, they recognize death when they see it. But instead, when they reach me, they stop, one bird on each side, the third standing above my head, as they begin to slowly spread their wings, broad and majestic, each feather articulated black against the blue cobalt sky, as they form above me a canopy, a shield against the sun. As the bird by my head slowly lowers its face towards me, its beak still moist from its feast within the automobile, as I say to the three of them, "I am not the man you think I am." But they look at me with a look I have so long craved. It is the look of a mother to a child. It is the look of unconditional love. Deep in the bowels of a brand new skyscraper, a woman is furiously digging her fingers deep into the bowels of a photocopier that is even newer than the brand new skyscraper. She is looking to parse meaning from the pictograms inscribed on the inside cover of the open door of the photocopier. Pictograms that are meant to wordlessly and thus simply explain how to remove a jammed piece of photocopy paper from a jammed photocopier. Needless to say, the level of her frustration is increasing in direct inverse proportion to how the size of the piece of paper is decreasing with each failed attempt she makes to pull it free. This is not her jam to clear. What's worse, she knows who jammed the photocopier. Because when she arrived at work this morning, when the elevator doors opened and she looked out across a sea of cubicles, she saw that there was only one other employee yet in the office. And unless this brand new photocopier had arrived from the factory this very morning with a jam already inside it, it was safe to say there really was only one possible culprit. Obviously, she would have to say something. And yet, she knew that because she was even newer to the office than the brand new photocopier, to say something without a full appreciation of the office politics at play would be perhaps to doom her career at some unknown point down the road, to end any chance of career advancement on this day, the very first day of her employment. And she wondered, would it always be thus? Her never making any real decisions of her own, always allowing fate to have its way with her, and then, before she could make any real decisions of her own, fate had its way with her. For no sooner had she finally cleared the last piece of jammed photocopy paper from the jammed photocopier, closed the door, stood back up, than she spied, standing in the open doorway of the photocopy room, the only other employee yet in the office. And he was standing there with a ream of paper in his hands and the look upon his face of a man who hoped to make some photocopies. She told herself, let it go. She dug the fingernails of her hands into the palm of her hands, hoping that the pain would be greater than the urge to proceed, and yet she felt drawn forward by a seemingly irresistible force, something the rest of us might call predetermination. As she heard herself saying to him, you know, I just cleared a jam from the photocopier. I wonder who could have jammed it. His reply, I have no idea. To tell you the truth, I don't really know very much about photocopiers. And perhaps if his response had betrayed even an iota of responsibility for the situation at hand, she could have let the entire thing go. But as it was, his reply was completely without guile, did not in any way acknowledge that his role in the situation at hand, right? Didn't in any way seem to acknowledge that beneath the seemingly innocuous raft of her question there was an ocean of accusation, and so she felt compelled to press her point. But what she said next would very well change the direction of both their lives. Is, I dare say, the very fulcrum upon which this entire story rests, as she heard herself saying to him, well, if this is what you think, then I guess Rome wasn't built in a day, was it? To which he then laughed. To which she then laughed as well, as she realized that that was a lot funnier than she'd intended. And if you, listening, do not fully understand why that should be funny, then understand that you are not meant to understand. For to understand would mean that you somehow were privy to what might well be the greatest secret mankind has ever kept from itself. A secret which I am going to tell you right now. Even though, yes, I know that in so doing, I will be making it somewhat less than the greatest secret mankind has ever kept from itself. But you see, just the day before this, there had been two brothers reclining on the side of a hill. Shepherds, actually, twins, if you must know, one born just 1 second before the other. And they were suckling on the teat of a wolf, because that's how these shepherds tended their flock. Not through physical intimidation of the wolves, but rather through intimidation that was entirely sexual, by literally making the wolves their bitches. But because there were shepherds in a neighboring village who found this behavior to be somewhat unbecoming of their chosen profession, they engaged the brothers in a conversation on the proper comportment between lupines and humans, a conversation that did not go well. And at the end of which, the neighboring shepherds said to the brothers, well, if you think that this is proper shepherding technique, then I guess Rome wasn't built in a day, was it? Expression that really stuck in the craw of the older brother. You see, up to this moment in history, you must understand that that expression, Rome wasn't built in a day, was only something that you would say to someone when that person was being delusional. And not delusional in some slip of the tongue, fly by night, oh my bad, didn't mean to say that way. No, they were exhibiting a delusion that suggested they constructed an entire worldview to support this one delusion, that they were living in a made-up world, in a city that was commonly referred to as Rome, since up to this point in history, that was a city that did not exist anywhere on Earth. And so, the ever so slightly older brother turned to his ever so slightly younger brother, pulling his lips from the teat of the wolf, wiping a dollop of milk from his cheek and saying, hey, you know what those neighboring shepherds said to us earlier today? Well, what if tomorrow we do build Rome so that they can never say that to us again? An idea to which the ever so slightly younger brother, as all younger siblings always do, readily agreed. And if Rome had been left to the two brothers, it would thereafter have consisted of two medium-sized shacks connected by a path that they would have dubbed the Via Appia. But it just so happened that making their way across the countryside, there was a horde of marauding barbarians who were raping and pillaging and plundering every village and town they came to of its silver and gold. Learning along the way, though, something that surely the rest of us already know, that money can't buy you love. So that these barbarians were in fact depressed barbarians. We're tired of everyone always calling them barbarians, and had begun to think to themselves that, the only real difference between a standing army that gets respect and barbarians is the affiliation to a city-state. And so talk had begun to bubble up amongst them that, what if, in addition to raising every village and town we come to, we raise one up of our own? Not only would this give their endless, meandering journeys some sense of completion, a place to return to, but let's face it, boys, they said, it'll make it easier to meet women, to start families, to send our children to good schools. And so when they met the shepherds on the side of the hill and heard their idea, they readily agreed, but on one condition. Because you must understand, the only thing about these barbarians that was actually refined was their sense of humor. And so, they agreed to help the brothers build Rome so long as it would only take one day to do so. And what's more, they said, it must appear to all the rest of the world for all the rest of time that it took much more than that to do it. And so, right at the stroke of midnight, a huge contingent of these barbarians immediately took to felling large swaths of forest, while other barbarians went to nearby cliffs and began hewing stones to lay down as foundations for government buildings and stately homes in fields that yet more barbarians were clearing to make level for these new buildings, while still other barbarians built a huge kiln and began producing the most lovely earthenware, pots and vases that yet more barbarians as quickly took to smashing against the newly laid foundations for the government buildings and stately homes, while still other barbarians, storytellers whose skills heretofore had been completely unnecessary, now eagerly sat in a circle and devised an entirely fictitious history for this fabricated city named Rome. A history which would never be written down in a single location, but rather would appear piecemeal, chiseled into broken bits of rock, carved into columns that themselves would never actually support a single ounce of weight, as other barbarians began inscribing small portraits into round pieces of silver of these fictitious leaders of this fabricated city named Rome, as a hastily constructed mint began reproducing these by the thousands right into the hands of yet more barbarians, who as eagerly took to throwing them into nearby rivers and streams and into the ever-filling fields, as still other barbarians constructed exactly one half of a magnificent Colosseum, while still more built long stone purposefully crumbling aqueducts which couldn't bury a drop of water even if they wanted to, while still more barbarians began building the cutest little cafes that ran along cobblestone streets that they had the foresight to underneath lay fiber optic cables so the cute little cafes would have internet connection. While other cafes built a huge foundry, these barbarians producing steel girder after steel girder that they erected into the skeleton of a fantastic skyscraper. But of course, Rome would have been for nothing if it had remained empty, a ghost town with no living souls. And so, under threat of death, the nearby villagers were conscripted to play the parts of Rome's denizens and employees, which is how a woman who just yesterday had been living with both her parents and a number of cousins, the number of which could never fully be counted, today found herself to be standing in front of an edifice that seemed to disappear straight up into the clouds. She stepped into a box, was whisked up through the entrails of this building even as it was still being constructed around her, and when the elevator doors opened, she looked out at a scene that seemed pulled right out of her dreams, a sea of cubicles that she was excited to explore as one might be excited to explore a hedgerow maze. She claimed one of the cubicles as her own, sat down in front of a box that she would later learn was called a computer, and by some stroke of magic managed to turn it on. And she giggled at the sensation of static electricity as she ran her tongue across the screen. She typed away at something called a keyboard, producing memo and faxes and PowerPoint presentations. She engaged spell check and grammar check for documents she couldn't actually read, since after all she was completely illiterate, which is why it was good that the inside cover of the photocopier was inscribed with pictograms to wordlessly and thus simply explain how to remove a jammed piece of photocopy paper from a jammed photocopier. Otherwise, said photocopier would have forever remained jammed. And which is why perhaps she should have had a bit more empathy for the only other employee in the office, since, like her, he never would have seen a photocopier in his life, would not have understood proper photocopying etiquette, that when you are the one to jam a photocopier, you should be the one to clear it. Come on, people, it's not that hard. That in fact, until just today, he'd been living alone in a cave. His only experience with women being that when he would see one he found attractive, he would cup his hands around his mouth and just sigh loudly and plaintively, sort of a hoping that would do for sexual titillation. It didn't, not ever, not once. And so put yourself in his shoes if you can. Imagine how strange it must be to suddenly find yourself in a room with a member of the opposite sex wearing such strange clothes, such as pants with pleats in a color you've never seen before called khaki, wearing a shirt that's so white that you have to shield your own eyes from your own torso, and around your neck a useless fabric tied into a knot adorned with paisleys, and together forming a sort of crude arrow pointing directly at your crotch. And then imagine that this woman makes you laugh by saying something quite so funny as Rome wasn't built in a day, on the very day when Rome is being built all around you. And so really, can we blame him for not knowing how to properly respond? Can we fault him for leaning forward and then eagerly beginning to make out? She was surprised to suddenly find herself with a tongue in her mouth. But because she was so new to the office, because she was afraid of ruining any chance at career advancement, she didn't know she could say no. And so it wasn't long before the two of them were wearing the kind of clothes they had long been accustomed to wearing, which is to say, not many clothes at all. as they found themselves atop the photocopier, groping for purchase, straddling both the machine and each other. And it's amazing, isn't it? A device which heretofore had refused to perform its duties as programmed, now suddenly did so with alacrity, filling the room with a cornucopia of pornographic photocopies. The next day, the company was out of business. No surprise. After all, it had no products and as such, no revenue, and it would have been foolish to have continued investing in it. And so the two of them would never see each other again. But he left something with her. A child that grew in her belly over the next 9 months. Her parents, of course, insisting that she give this child up for adoption. After all, they said, a single mother her age, what chance would she have of career advancement? And you must understand that in her, they saw their only chance of ever escaping this grass hut that they lived in with a number of cousins, the number of which could never fully be counted. After all, she was the very first person in the family to actually own a resume, even if the only thing on that resume was 1 day of employment at a company that had no name. And so on the day of the child's birth, it was pulled from her grasp and pulled from her womb at once, before she'd even had a chance to look him directly in the eyes, before she could count his fingers and toes, before she could even give him a name. She would thereafter wonder, what chance might a boy have who's never known even one moment of love from his mother? And she would be visited by nightmares thereafter, wondering if he'd grown into a monster, wondering if he was safe, if he'd ever known happiness, desiring to one day see him again, feeling at once that all of creation perhaps had been for this one moment of regret. But, you know what they say, right? That which doesn't kill you makes you stronger, doesn't it? Right? I mean, come on. Hardly need to tell you this. After all, you were such a sickly child. Oh, the smallest unexpected noise, the littlest startle, and you would suddenly be moved to throw up, either upon your own chest or upon the faces of those unfortunate enough to be standing in front of you, usually your parents or friends. And worse is that you had the unfortunate affliction of only throwing up out of your nose. But in every other way, you were an easygoing child. You never knew a real moment of pain in your entire childhood, and you had the unique vantage point of learning at a very early age that it's the very things that most disgust us that we find most compelling. As such, you found yourself to be the focal point of most every social occasion. The other kids enjoying nothing more than buying you large tubs of Rocky Road ice cream that they would watch as you engorged yourself on them. Everybody eager for the moment when a kid would sneak up behind you, unexpectedly clap in your ear, and you would be startled to spew forth a volcanic geyser of bile and half-digested ice cream. The kids all running, scattering in every direction, you playfully giving chase, hoping to leave your mark upon their ankles. The girls crying out with squeals of disgust that were only a hair's breadth away from squeals of delight. Of course, over time you learned to control your sickness, which is not to say you knew how to make it stop, but you did learn that if you constricted the inner lining of one nostril and held the other one closed with one finger, you could then redirect your regurgitation into a fine point, the end of which you learned to manipulate as an artist might manipulate a brush. So that while other children might walk by freshly fallen snow and sloppily inscribe their names in their own urine, you, if properly startled, could saunter past and leave behind a signature that looked as if it were written by a fountain pen. You were becoming an artist, you realized. The day the school bell rang a few minutes early and you were startled to spew forth a work of art upon your desk. Your friend derisively saying, if that could hang on the wall of a museum, to which you thought so it could. You pooled your own meager resources thereafter. You rented out a black box theater. You were able to procure a set of bleachers from your high school's dwindling athletic program. And you sold tickets to your one-man show. And on the night of your performance, you were the only one who was not surprised that the line ran down the block and around the corner, everybody eager to get a seat to watch as you sat on a small stage in front of a large bathtub filled with eggplant parmesan, emptied cans of creamed corn, plates of veal scallopini, and pie after pie of banana cream. In between large mouthfuls, you would slowly recite a monologue about gluttony, everyone on the edges of their seat, awaiting that moment when a gong would be rang behind you and you, startled, would spin round and spew forth onto a 10 by 10 foot canvas a word written in your very own font, a word such as hunger, or bulimia, or mother. You were the darling of the art world. No surprise, after all, your art was something not to be passively experienced as other art in museums. No, it was something that you needed to sit in the room with, as it was retched into being, to smell the aroma, to hear the sounds, was to feel oneself in the very maelstrom of creativity itself. To attend one of your solo shows with your friends would necessarily mean you would be debating late into the night on the very nature of art and theater, and whether yours was merely a symptom of a sickness deep within the bowels of society itself. You were becoming a local celebrity, you realized. And as such, you decided it was time for you to dress the part. Done you were with simple shirts and pants. No, thereafter, you wore only the very smallest of vests, the material hanging to just below your nipples. On your crotch, you wore gold spandex shorts that hugged your jewels as if indeed there were a thief on the loose. And on your feet, you wore cleats, as if to suggest that in the throes of creation, you needed traction, lest you slip, fall, and drown in your art. You joined a circus, the better to spread your arts across the land, and along the way, you could and did have any woman you wanted. And no, did not bother you to know that the only reason they slept with you was just to tell their friends that they had. And of course, you knew that these friends would ask their friends whether at the height of orgasm you had clapped in your face to see whether I would produce upon your bosom a work of art. Ha! So it's strange, isn't it? There was so much beauty to choose from. The woman who should have caught your eye, ooh, she was not ugly, but she was neither attractive by any standard measure, nor by any measure for which there was no standard. Your circus had come to a small town. You first spied her down an alleyway where she was manning a cart that sold a variety of jams that were remarkable only for how unremarkable they were. Jams such as peanut butter jam and jam and jelly jam. Of course, you could have purchased the entire contents of her cart all in one go, perhaps impressed her with your financial acumen, but of course that would have robbed you of the opportunity of returning to her cart every single day and engaging her in wonderful conversation. And when you discovered that she had never in her life been to the circus, You mustered the courage then to come and see you perform. And that night, with her sitting in the stands, I dare say, was the very pinnacle of your career. As in a fit of inspiration, you asked the trapeze artist to step aside. Them saying, "Do you know what you're doing?" You said, "No, I did not." And as the light swirled around you, climbed up that most narrow of ladders to the very apex of the circus tent. As you swung out upon a trapeze, and far below you a cannon boomed, and you startled, spun, and spewed upon an upside-down canvas, a perfectly formed heart that you watched recede as you fell to the netting below, thinking to yourself, that is not for sale. The crowd went bananas as the two of you talked late into the night, long after the echoes of their applause had faded into silence. And you know not what you spoke, but it was exciting, and it felt good, and it felt right. And when you learned that not only had she never been to the circus, but she'd never been to a carnival, you asked her to follow you outside, and ooh, that moment when your hand touched hers, ooh, you felt a ripple of electricity run across your every nerve and fiber, dance between your dendrites and axons as you led her outside to the Ferris wheel. It was dark out here. No one was around. She said, "Are we allowed?" To which you said, "These are our lives. We should make them everything that they can possibly be. Live them to the fullest." As you sat her in one of the cars of the Ferris wheel and then turned the machine on, but by the time you were able to catch back up, she was already 2 cars ahead of you, and you had to climb through the matrix of the ride even as it continued spinning round, an act of daring do that you hoped would impress her as much as it impressed yourself. And when finally you sat down beside her, your girth very nearly caused the swinging chair to tip over backwards, very nearly caused the two of you to tumble like pinballs through the matrix of the machine, causing the two of you to giggle, as a couple always will when in the throes of possible love and possible death at once. You don't know what you spoke of as you rode that ride round, no surprise. The mind becomes like a sieve when the heart leads a conversation, but you know that it was good and it was right. So much so that you were suddenly moved to say to her, "I love you, and what's more, I always will." To which she said, "How can you know?" And there are those amongst us who would have us believe that love is merely some alchemical reaction between pheromones and the candy upon which our eyes enjoy feasting, but they don't know what we know, that deep within the furthest chamber of our heart there is a quarter reserved for knowing love when it knows love, so much so that you were able to say to her, "I just know." And you reached in a tiny pocket of your tiny vest and took out your artwork from earlier in the night, your perfectly formed heart, which she unfolded before you, a token of your affection, as her eyes filled with tears, for no one had ever expressed themselves thus. And you watched the sun rise, seeming not only to herald a new day, but an entirely new life. But of course, it was all just an illusion. For no sooner had the sun rose than it set once again, as you rode the Ferris wheel back down. And there are those amongst us who have the strange allergic reaction that when you look directly at the sun, you are moved to sneeze. No one knows why. But for this reason, you've never looked directly at our closest star, have you? But don't feel bad. You're not the first to be deceived by the false promise of a new day. And maybe, if you had not been so diligently practicing your art for so many years, the inner lining of your nose would not be quite so thin, the skin above it not quite so like onion paper, so much so that when you looked into that sun, beautiful, big, and orange, you sneezed a sneeze so powerful it blew your nose clean off your face. You ejaculated a geyser of blood from the very center of your head, as recesses deep within the furthest chambers of your cerebellum were exposed to the cold outside world for the very first time, as you were plunged into a pain more exquisite than any joy you'd ever known, as beside you the woman you loved screamed in horror in fear, screamed for somebody, anyone please, to come and help, but there was, of course, no one around. And you were forced to ride that amusement round and round until you had drenched the entire attraction in your very own blood. And of course, when the owners did arrive, they were furious to see that it was being operated without their proper supervision. And maybe if you were still able to perform your act, you would not in that moment have been summarily dismissed, sent home alone, in disgust of yourself, of your appearance. And it's amazing, isn't it, how quickly things can all vanish. Because it was right around this time that your art, which even at this moment hung in the living rooms and dining rooms of the most stately homes, had begun to grow upon all its surfaces a thin white fuzz, had in a word begun to rot. No surprise. After all, your art knew not that it was art, and so your compositions had begun to decompose so quickly. Your sense of self, your financial well-being, your status in the world, your belief in what you are doing, gone. You're left with nothing except that woman who sat by your side. She proved true as she held sponge in hand and continued cleaning that hole in your face of the ever-oozing pus and blood, and still at moments of startle, ever more unfortunate regurgitation. You beseeched her to please leave your bedside, to not be beholden to your pain, but she said, "Oh, I am not the woman you think I am, and that the hole in your face is as nothing to the hole in my heart." She then tells you stories of how she is visited nightly by nightmares of a family, a mother, a father, and a child. Visions of their Sunday meals, of their movie nights, of their vacations to the beach, of their family reunions, of their barbecues, of their card nights, flying kites, of their laughter. Scenes of such exquisite normalcy that she worries, what if they are real and I am merely the product of their nightmares? And when she's awake, she tells you it is, of course, no better, as she's haunted by a child that was pulled from her womb and pulled from her grasp before she'd had a chance to look him in the face, before she'd had a chance to give him a name, before she'd had a chance to give him even one moment of love. And she asks you, what chance does a boy have in this world who's never known even one moment of love from his mother? And as she descends into tears, becomes a puddle of water around you, it occurs to you that your whole life has been one long exercise in solipsism. And then maybe you can rise from your own sense of disgust. Help someone else. Help this woman find her child. It's difficult to say when you're in the very middle of the desert, but it certainly feels as if it's the hottest day of the year as you are riding in the front seat of a big, boxy car that is bouncing down a dirt track that's been etched into the face of the desert like a long scar that stretches all the way towards either the horizon or infinity, whichever you might come to first. Outside, the landscape is flat and barren and so intensely beige as to be almost no color at all. But if you look up through the front windshield, you can see a perfectly blue sky. Not a cloud in it, not a bird, no sign of life whatsoever. You've been driving for well over 1,000 miles, fueled by power bars and successively full tanks of gas, led ever onwards by the woman you love, who sits in the passenger seat beside you, though even she will admit that even as she directs you forward, she has no idea where she is going. I've never made a single decision in my life, she tells you. And she explains that she is merely feeling pulled ever forward by a seemingly irresistible force, something the rest of us might call predetermination. And then, far off in the road, you can see there something's blocking it. You slow the car down as you are able to see it is some hastily made barricade, manned by an old man sitting in an old chair beneath an old umbrella. You slow the car down and lower the window. He says to you, you do not want to continue forward because that way lies death. The woman leans across your lap, saying to the old man, I feel that my son is lost somewhere out there. To which the old man says, if your son is lost out there, then he will never be found. The woman says, we have no choice but to continue forward. To which you then look at her as if to say, really? No choice? But she quickly gives you a look back that makes it clear, indeed, no choice. The old man saying, well, don't say that you weren't warned. As you slowly drive around the barricade and continue down the road. And as you drive further, the car begins to cough, to sputter, and then die. But because the road is sloping ever downward, you don't come to a stop. In fact, you go ever quicker as the road continues further and further down, deeper into the earth. You are at the top of what seems to be a deep valley, and you are surprised to see that at the bottom of it there are so many cars, just like your own, all of them dead. And beside them, their drivers, equally dead, having failed to escape the featureless labyrinth of this valley. And you roll past them, their skin burned in the sun, peeling off their bones. The only living creatures here, vultures, who watch as you roll past with an eagerness in their eyes. Until at long last you come to a rolling stop, next to another big boxy car much like your own, this one flipped onto its back, inside of which you find two skeletons. One of a woman who you imagine could not have been attractive, hard to tell, she just has a skull with hair. Beside her, the driver, who has a hole in his face, much like your own. Beside the car, not far away, a large pile of bleached white bones, not of humans, but of birds, of vultures. Atop it there stand three old birds, their wings spread, the three of them tottering, as if ready to collapse beneath that sun, beneath the strain of holding up their wings for so long, as if they might in an instant decay, adding their own bones to the pile. Young vultures round the bottom of the pile, eager to replace them. The woman you love says that way and begins scrambling up the pile of bones, and you feel obligated to follow. At the top of which she looks down and sees, well, me lying at the bottom. She scrambles her way down towards me, saying, is it you? To which I say, Mother, through chapped lips, as Tears immediately fill her eyes, and she collapses down onto her knees next to me and gently pulls me into her lap, wraps her arms around me, envelops me in an embrace that I have so long longed for. And it is more than I could have imagined. More full, more complete, as she rocks me back and forth, saying, I found you. I found you at long last. I have been looking my entire life. I have been looking for you, and I will save you. We will take you out from here. We will bring you out, and we will be a family. We will have meals together. We'll have vacations. We'll visit the beach. We'll play cards. We'll have barbecues. We will be the family that I have oh so long dreamed of being. To which I say, oh, Mother, this embrace, this moment is more than I ever actually believed might happen. But you must understand, this is all that can happen. Because inside me, I have the mind of a monster. And lo, these many years I have been lying here in this desert. It has slowly been creeping its way back into my body, and it will not be long before it takes full control of me and begins to march upon humanity once again. That I will, as I have done so many times, spread pestilence and death across this land. For surely you recognize me, Mother. I am the one they call the Butcher. And it's at this moment that you recognize me. You recoil as you think, oh my God, it is true. And even my mother, she knows. She pulls back. I am the face of that monster that has led 1,000 armies, barbarians, all of them raping and pillaging and plundering so many countrysides, so many cities, so many towns, so many people, spreading pain, spreading fear, spreading chaos for no further reason than I am driven by pain. I have been alive for centuries and will not ever perish unless, Mother, I say, I am lit aflame. And I look at you then, and you understand. You go to the car, you get a tube, and you begin siphoning gasoline out right onto me as my mother is saying, no, please don't. And you have a book of matches then. You're like, no, we must do this if he says. And my mother says, no, give me the matches. If anyone will do this, I will do this then. I will do this. I've made no decisions ever in my life. Allow me. And she looks at me then, and I say, thank you, Mother, please, for saving me, for releasing me. And she lights a match, and through tears throws it upon my chest, and I ignite. I burst into flames. I will not begin to explain the pain. Instead, understand there is relief. There is relief. As I reach my hand towards my mother, who tries to grasp my own, but you pull her back and say, no. You will disappear in the flames as well. And then my arm drops, and I am turned into ash. I dissipate into smoke. And just below me, I can see my mother and you becoming further and further away, as the blue sky becomes ever darker, and I dissipate into space itself, where we all will meet our end. Even the universe itself shall one day die. But I can only hope that you will retain an image like I have of a mother, of someone who loves you. A vision of a woman so much more beautiful than anything I could have hoped. A vision that has me believing that perhaps all of love and all of creation was for this one moment.